So we already heard that you are going to hear from me. This is going to be a thesis. There are two different directions that we can go in when it comes to our different associations, and of course also with Glass Saxony and Baden-Württemberg. I'm going to present to you our thesis now, and then later on we are going to hear the anti-thesis, and afterwards we are going to fight on stage, and that is going to be very much a great situation. So, of course, when it comes to safety glass for these floor elements, what do we need? It's very interesting. What you see here is our association. We're based in Karlsruhe, that's a school, and also the headquarter. I already got the introduction from my colleague just now, so I don't need to do that. But let's look into what kind of norms and standards we have within the production. So, of course, they've been around for a very long time. There was not even a Dean Association at that point in time. On the left-hand side, we actually have some iron. So, if they actually started 400 years before Christ, this is how they did it. They actually had these bars that had this drop shape. They were 3 to 4 kilos, and they actually did that in Celtic times once in Europe. This is what the bars looked like. And of course, this was just a standard back then. On the right-hand side, to your right, you can see the glass cylinder, and this is sort of like a ship that actually left before Christ. It sank on a coast, and you could actually see that on the chronology. And you can see that they had 175 glass cylinders on board, and they also had different things like zinc, for example, and other products, but also these glass cylinders that they actually left on the coast. And even then, that was 1,300 years ago, so 3,300 in total. They actually had some norms for these glass cylinders. That's how they produced them. And then they actually adapted that and sold them. And they actually made some jewelry and pearls out of it. So girls even loved it 3,000 years ago. They were impressed by glass, not maybe necessarily window glass, but it was glass for pearls and jewelry. So if you look at the Bible, you are going to see the Dean 1808 in the Bible, and that was the Apostle Story 20.9. So a young man was sitting on a windowsill, and because he talked for so long, he was actually falling asleep, and he fell 3 stories deep out of the window. And when he was picked up, he was dead. Paulus then actually hugged his dead body and he said, "Okay, calm down. He is alive." And they were able to bring him back home while he was alive. What did we learn from that? Well, point one, if a speaker is speaking up here, he should speak in a way that you're not falling asleep. But if you are falling asleep, then of course a balcony glass would have been very good because that would have made him fall out the window, right? And if you don't have, then the speaker should at least be able to work some miracles. And for that reason, you are not sitting 3 stories high, but you're on the ground, so nothing can happen. All right. So if we now look at the Dean 1806, so what happened chronologically? So in 2015, the first idea came up for this new Dean 18008, and safety glass was very important, and that was what they wanted to implement. That was what the requirement was. That's what they wanted. It was okay, and we said, okay, we're going to have to look into that. And we actually looked at that more specifically, and we did that without any help. So vertical glass is going to have to be up to 80 centimeters height at the accessible side, and safety glass needs to be used. So that's when the discussion started. Freely accessible. What does that mean for a French balcony, for example? So if you open it, would it be the glass side, the one that you open to the inside? Yes, said some. Others said no. But we then agreed, or they then agreed, that even there we would need some safety glass on both sides. And now something happened that was very unique for me back then. None of the glass industries actually published that so far. So it wasn't even done. The norm analysis was approved, but it was published, and they said, okay, there's going to be safety glass soon. Take care, watch out. And there were also some insulation glass companies that told their end customers, please keep in mind that when it comes to balcony doors, we're going to have to sell safety glass because that's going to be mandatory soon. There was some resistance, but now Switzerland, for example, they've changed their norm as well. So in Switzerland, what is happening around us? Well, in Switzerland, ever since January 2018, they have safety glass for all floor sized glass up to 1 meter. So every balcony glass here has safety glass in Austria. They've been doing that for longer, 10 years actually, to be precise. And they've been using the safety glass for 10 years, so up to 1 meter 50. Italians have been doing that since January 2018, so they have the strictest rule. I would say they really don't have any places in a house where they don't have any safety glass, so it's quite a lot. So everywhere around us, we can see the safety glass. Okay, so how many deaths do we have in Germany when it comes to falling off balconies? It's not a lot. We know that there are accidents on stairs. Those are actually captured as well. We have 1,363 people who actually die from falling off the stairs, and nobody really talks about that, to be honest. So if I think about our discussion that we've had over the past few years about safety glass when it comes to balcony doors, of course, stairs is something nobody talks about. People would think that there should be some airbags or in staircases or something like that because people are dying, but nothing is happening. We also, according to our statistics, we don't have any specific numbers in terms of how many people actually fall off balconies. So in Austria, we do have that though. They actually have the number of people who fall through glass doors in rooms. In Austria, it's 1,300 people per year who get injured because of that, and they are captured statistically. So if we now calculate that for Germany, we can say, okay, we would probably be at about 13,000 people in Germany who actually fall through room doors and are injured because of that, but that doesn't include balcony doors because there aren't any numbers that are captured. And part of this discussion would also be that do we want it? Do we have it? Should it come or not? Yes, there were a couple different countering opinions. So, of course, they actually talked to the government when they heard about the fact that there should be safety glass because at the same time as the glass industry who now asked for safety glass, which also makes it a little bit more expensive obviously, the electronics industry also has some safety relevant changes that needed to be implemented. So that's what they wanted. And part of that would be streams when it comes to woodwork and wood buildings. And that was just roughly 2,500 euros extra for buildings. So that would just be for the electronics industry and for the sample house that we see in the background here, the safety glass would be about 2,100 euros extra. And now the building industry just raised their hand and they said, okay, slow down. That is going to be too much for us. And what we know today is that in the background, Baden-Württemberg as a state already worked on the mandatory solar panels on ceilings, which was just implemented last year. And of course, that makes everything a lot more expensive when you build a new building. You need to have that in Baden-Württemberg now, and that's about 30,000 euros extra. And of course, that was always in the background. So those were just price increases. And then the building minister conference, so that would be the conference of all the different heads of state in Germany. So all 16 of them met in January of 2019 and came to the conclusion that they did not want safety glass. So their recommendation was that they wanted it to be the same as it was before. And the wording was the guideline that was recommended for many years should be implemented as such. So the recommendation officially was don't use safety glass. And of course, there was also some pressure on the Norm Commission. So in 2020, they then published DIN 18006. So now it was actually set in place. There were no changes anymore. And even if you wanted to say anything against it, you couldn't. So the norm was printed, and it was also the zero point 0.8 meter rule that was gone as well. So that means based on the regulatory rules, there are requirements for glass, and of course, there are some limitations to access or also using glass with safe braking behavior. So the zero point 0.8 meter rule is not there anymore. And then there's also reference to paragraph 37 of the MBO and the wording of the ordinance that is in place already. So for the very first time, it is very important to know that, oh, can we go back, please? So up here, because of the regulatory rules, there are some indications here. So for the very first time, we heard, okay, it's going to have to be a legal requirement. So we then looked into the set of rules, paragraph 37, and that was the model building code. So they just said that it was generally accessible areas have to be labeled so that they can be recognized easily, okay? So it doesn't have to be safety glass, you just have to label them to be recognized easily. And of course, there was a discussion between all the different associations talking about generally accessible. So we just argued and said, okay, you know what? I really like rules and regulations. And if you speak some Latin, just general Latin, so it's really affecting the community, right? That's what I know from my Latin. And if you really think about the wording, it's really affecting everyone. So we discussed it for a very long time. So all the different associations said, okay, no, general would also be just your private bedroom door. And over the past few years, we just sort of understood it incorrectly. So we thought, okay, if there are some indications in Latin and people don't understand that, and if they haven't read about all the different words, we're just going to do it differently. We are going to ask them. We are going to ask the building ministry. So that was the magazine GFF, Glass and Facade. Mr. Metzger was the editor back then. He then asked the building ministry, and back then the building ministry was represented by Lower Saxony, and we just asked them, okay, what do you say about the term generally accessible? And the building minister conference in Schleswig-Holstein then said, well, if it says generally accessible, then the door needs to be generally accessible for everybody, right? And now you're gonna have to decide, is your bedroom door accessible to everybody or not? And we then also asked more questions. How about if it's a house for several different families? And in the past, we also had some doors, for example, they didn't have any safety glass back then. And we just asked, okay, how about this? So the building ministry back then said generally accessible means that it's generally accessible and private is private. Ah, you're already smiling. I think my colleague has a different opinion later on. And now we're sitting here in Karlsruhe, and we just said, okay, so if our association is based in Karlsruhe, we should actually look into the archive of the German justice, and we just need to really look into, okay, these high courts in Germany, do they have any publication in terms of generally accessible? And yes, the court actually has published something in November of 2016 for a different case, and they defined the term generally accessible. It was about information back then. Is information generally accessible if only lawyers have access? And the court said clearly, no, generally accessible means that everybody has access to it. It can be limited in terms of times or the amount of money you have to pay if you want to get information from an archive, but generally accessible means that everybody has access to it. So the court actually ruled on that. And then we have another point because we said, okay, if the term generally accessible is also applicable in private spaces, then all the different norms, for example, about toilets and generally accessible buildings, then of course that would also apply in private buildings. And when it comes to toilets in general areas, public areas, when it comes to doors and sizes and moving space, etc., we also have some norms and rules and regulations. So all of that would also have to be transferred to private buildings. So that can't be right. So again, with a written explanation of the building ministry saying generally accessible is definitely not the private space. And as the court in Karlsruhe ruled, we just knew, okay, generally accessible, which is exactly what we said from the beginning. Communists would be affecting the community. And we just thought, okay, this is not going to be in the private sector. Okay, and at the same time, that also means if you then summarize everything, DIN 18008 requires for space that there's no safety glass up until the floor, only if everything is in the public space. That's when it's needed, except, and of course, the rules are very clear that we already have. For example, if it's fall-proof glass, they're different than that. And also exceptions would be that we didn't have in the past, would be a house with several families living there. So be the door to the apartment and the door to the whole house. So, for example, if you have 3 floors, then you would have don't need to have control over who's walking by your apartment door, so you don't need safety glass for that. So the building ministry also confirmed that in writing. Then the whole door to the house, we need safety glass for that. And then when it comes to public buildings and shop, one example that is not really finally discussed yet, but all the private buildings that we've discussed before are not included here. So that can just be regular glass. And that was very important to us because in Karlsruhe, we get requests on a weekly basis from window builders who were forced by architects to take out their glass and replace it with safety glass. And we just said to them, okay, there's a clear rule confirmed by the highest court in Germany and also the building ministry. What else do we want, right? So all of that is set in stone now. And if we now look into the changes in comparison to early, so if it's doors leading into a house, it would be safety glass, and if it's official buildings, it would be the outside window. And for example, windows, when they're mounted on the floor, then they're gonna have to be safety glass. Of course, you can also use safety glass as a recommendation. And of course, that's what we're gonna hear from my colleague. I think they're gonna say, okay, we recommend safety glass, but I'm not gonna ask you recommending safety glass. If any of you is purchasing a small car, let's say you go to a Fiat dealer and you purchase a Fiat 500, they're not going to give you um, a little sheet for Rolls Royce and say, okay, this is much better for your safety. Why don't you just sign that I offered you a Rolls Royce and you declined to purchase a Rolls Royce and then you get to buy a Fiat 500? That doesn't work. Both of them are approved. Both of them have official approval to be out in the streets. And that's why we're saying, okay, we have a very clear rules. So you can sell safety glass if you want to, of course you can, but the recommendation of saying, okay, for safety reasons, you're going to have to buy it. It's possible that somebody is going to fall into that glass, and at one point in time, a judge is going to come up with the idea and then say, I'm guilty. Well, okay, that can always happen. And that would sort of be like, um, actually killing yourself because you're afraid of death. So we just need a clear rule and regulation in our law, and then that's it. Window shops, that is something that is going to be debatable in the future. Do we need safety glass? Yes or no? And of course, the Association of Baden-Württemberg, if you are affected as a window builder, they actually have some decisions. They also have a letter that they have written. That's the sort of like a statement that is listed. You can have that. And please always think about that not every state has the DIN 18008 introduced. Right now it's 10 out of 16. So 6 are still missing. And Baden-Württemberg is actually the state that hasn't introduced it yet. Again, back then, I think Baden-Württemberg actually only joined in 2018 with the introduction of DIN 18008, so pretty late. And please make sure you know what your state is like. It's not introduced everywhere. So overall, to summarize, very rarely was the introduction of a new DIN really come in hand with so many different disputes and arguments. And if you actually quote Heinrich Heine, if I think about Germany at night, I think about DIN 18008, just as a joke. And yeah, exactly. So I would like to thank you for your attention. That was the thesis of our association from Baden-Württemberg, and I'm now going to hand back over.
Right, so as announced, I am also going to present now, and of course I'm going to try to not tell you the whole thing twice, and I just want to maybe have a little bit of a different focus than Mr. Sieber for his presentation. So 1808, this is of course very dangerous glass, of course. So now all of this has been introduced. Mr. Sieber just listed in which federal states all of this has been introduced or not. And honestly speaking, I'm not a huge fan of making it too complicated, and sometimes I might also be seeing it a bit more simply than Mr. Siebert, I'm also not a fan of the states where it hasn't been introduced saying, oh, wow, this is complete freedom, so please do not rely on it too much. If this is out there in the world, especially if it's been discussed up and down for years and years and years, accompanied by specialist publications by the media, I would always assume that purely based on this public discussion, there's also a certain state of the art that is now out in the world and that has been discussed. And with that, of course, also independent of the question whether the standard is now going to be fully introduced in the individual federal states, that this will have a certain relevance, to be careful, to put it mildly. Now, 18008, here's the famous bathroom window that is used for the small glazing. So, DIN 18008, that's not exactly what we're talking about, right? 18008 is not just safety glass. It's not just regulation, no regulation for floor to ceiling glazing. It's actually the measurement norm and this entire discussion, right? These 5 years that went up and down and up and down. Unfortunately, this has really delayed significantly the introduction of the 1808. And this was tricky because the previous version made it very difficult to look at these small glass panels and glazings and have them in dimensions, the glass thickness in dimensions that we were used to forever and ever, and the way that we also knew that it was going to be working in practice. Now, this was recognized for a very long time. It was also, the 1808 wasn't a draft version forever and ever, but it wasn't introduced for this one particular topic. So good news, now that we have it here, this is actually a lot simpler as well. Now, we associations, of course, always love to point out that we helped with these publications. So we do have the respective publication, and you can see it right here. This is regarding the new DIN 18008 for small format multi-pane glasses. And of course, the security level or safety level that was required in the DIN has been a little bit reduced. And for example, these simple toilet windows are now just generally easier handleable. But of course, this is also what we've heard today, right? The requirement for safety glass under the balustrade or railing height. So here, for example, we've seen this. We thought, is this okay? That this is okay to do the way that we've done it. Now, we always thought, or I always thought, if you talk to lay people, as people who are not working with glass in your circle of friends, and tell them that such a glazing like this can be done with regular breakage glass, and then if a kid runs in there, it just breaks. That's weird, and they would always say, because then everybody would think, oh, in a country like Germany where everything is so minutely regulated that this is admissible is very odd. And Mrs. Siebert actually did just mention all of this, so this is how it should have been. This was the draft. Now, we were part of the people who really stood up for this. We would have loved to have this. Now, what actually happened from our perspective was a tsunami of discussion, which was also a bit surprising to us, honestly. Now, none of us really expected this. That's why also what Mrs. Sieber mentioned happened, that glass manufacturer said, oh, this is going to come soon. So everybody really believed it. I believed it. I believed that this was going to come soon. But then we only got the tsunami of discussion afterwards. And now, of course, we promised you a little bit of confrontation. If we look at what we got in terms of counterpoints, counter arguments against this to make this mandatory or not, that we have to have mandatory safety glass. Please, what were the counter arguments? And I actually learned communicationally that we were very free with this and that we, communicated it freely. And this is also going to lead to products with a higher value creation. And that would, of course, be good for everybody involved. And I would have never expected, never expected that everybody downstream, so the the representatives of the trade would consider this as the source of all evil. I actually expected that we were going to be praised. I was thinking, oh, this is excellent work for the association if we can make sure that in a standard you can include an obligatory requirement for a more premium product. That's something that every single association would dream of to get this sort of stuff through. But I learned that that was not the case. So the fact that the products would get more expensive was one of the crucial points against it. Oh, it's going to get more expensive. In my uh, initial comment, I already said, well, 8% value creation of the product would be just glass. Well, now it would be maybe 9, maybe. And now you really have to think about how to top this up to get the money back. Now, we assumed that this was going to be at a time when we all thought that we could hide the cost for with the consumers, but at the moment, what's going on with the public discussion about general price increases with construction, it's of course tricky. You can of course read it on a daily basis that even the regular upper crust, medium income families are struggling a bit. So maybe the discussion is nowadays a bit different. But back then, we couldn't really get it. We didn't really get that you said, oh, the window mustn't get 200 euros more expensive, or maybe even just 20 euros. I don't know. Of course, if you extrapolate it to the house, Mrs. Sieber, that you showed, there are, of course, relatively many floor to ceiling um, glasses. Now, when it comes to products getting more expensive, I didn't really quite get it so far, but I also never got that this is the main issue of the window industry, that the products are too expensive. And this is something that, was a big point of discussion. And also the other thing is, there are no damages. There are no damages. Where are all the people who died because they fell through non-safety glass terrace doors? And we said, well, how many do you want? Is one person who died per year enough? Does it have to be 100 people a year who die? What's going on there? So nobody can really define it. And it's also just more than once that I heard from colleagues in other associations who said, should we really wait for a big spectacular case and it's going to be in all the magazines that maybe some celebrity fell through a terrace door and died? That's definitely also something that you can find, by the way, if you Google it. I think the former drummer of ABBA, no, they're all still alive, some celebrity group actually died because at his house on Mallorca, he fell through the terrace door. So that certainly wouldn't have happened if this had been made of safety glass. But the point is, and I'm very happy that we're all on the same page with this, Mr. Sieber also explained it. The point is not saying there's no damages, no claims. It's just that it's not been logged properly. So you can't just really take any parallel statistics and say, oh, it's going to be this and this in Austria, and that's also not going to have anything in Germany. So that's not holding any water. So of course, just because we don't have any statistics doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. And then of course also other points, we're always going towards, you've quoted a lot of things from South Germany, and then also from our region, we always say, oh, it did go well. It did go well. Why do we need additional regulation? It went okay in the end. Again, maybe also some representatives of the trades. I'm not looking at anybody, but they also sometimes have um, dubious uh, opinions, and they say, "Oh, it's always going to be us who get to decide this what is going to be dangerous and what is not, and where we need safety glass and where we don't." That's not anything that we need to enshrine in law. And I always thought, okay, that's a bit strange. Of course, I mean, sure, you've got the specialty competence, sure, but just because somebody has that specialist competence doesn't mean that we don't have to have any general codified regulations that we write down in a standard. That's not mutually exclusive. An additional thing that we always say, we don't know it, we don't need it, let's get rid of it. That's something that we always say in our region. sort of again going in the same direction, just like a general aversion of wanting to change anything. And again, I can just repeat this. This was really a bit much for us. We didn't really expect that. We really expected a broad appreciation for all of this, for the fact that we should be using safety glass. And Mr. Sieber said it. At the end of the day, it was the construction ministries in the different countries who said, well, yeah, you can introduce that, but we're not going to actually use it. And of course, the point was the cost increased for the construction. So it wasn't the fact that we didn't need this, it was just because it wasn't on vogue even at that time. And then we also had the discussion about the fire switches, cheap building, creating affordable apartments. Also, those are definitely political goals. So anything and everything that had to do with that, really making it more expensive, just wasn't on vogue at that particular time. And that's really kind of what we got from that initial version. That's also how it started. Now, the main thing was glass surfaces need to be aligned in a way that they can be recognized easily. I brought you a great example for that. This is not a door. If you so want to run through the pane, please do it with a lot of momentum. So that's, of course, going to work with regular glass. With enough speed, you can simply break through the glass, of course. And I think this is definitely also enough um, highlighting. Usually, this is probably going to look like that without any handwritten signs. Or maybe actually 40 years ago, that's what it looked like. So could be with some different highlights, lowlights. And I also told you, as an association and as a representative of the association, we always like to show off certain papers and achievements that we've been able to pull off. And in the meantime, this entire discussion, and maybe some of you are a bit older, I remember Mr. Siebert, you might as well. Um, we always talk about risk assessment, right? What's happening for the handyman? So there's still a paper, and I will once again just try to tell you to look at this. It's still very valid and very pertinent. And here we try to put a system to it. Uh, what is the probability that glass can break? This probability should be relatively low. And here are some very tiny, very small glass openings outside of walking paths. So if nobody runs into it, nothing's going to happen. And then, of course, we also have balcony doors with a very low track, or something like this, very low area, like for example the balcony where nothing much is going to happen, or the small doors, the doors with the very small glass areas, and then also maybe the bigger glass area right next to it. But then, of course, it's much more likely if you have the glass in the walking direction, and then maybe you're also thinking about an open element. So if maybe a wing of a door is right in your walking path, or glass dividers, the outside of glazings and access on entry areas, that's really more public accessibility. I'm also going to be speaking about that. And that's where we're really going to have to assess the risk. And then, of course, you have examples like this, where it's a lot more likely. So here, everybody's going to say, okay, this is obviously publicly accessible, obviously a lot of glass to floor, floor to ceiling elements made of glass, and maybe it's a bit more risky. Now, the paper also offers certain solutions for these protective and safety measures listed in increasing risk reduction. So, of course, you need to highlight it at the very beginning. And then we have lots and lots of measures, like, for example, introduce the circle of users to the risk, maybe put some plants in front of it, so limit accessibility. And again, here it says is the biggest thing, have glass with the right fracture behavior, ESG, VFG, or any films or layers applied afterwards. All of these could be different measures. Here, for example, you can see nobody's going to walk across the sofa or walk over the plants or walk over the heater, so you can limit accessibility. Now, of course, with the heater, you could definitely also argue that somebody is actually going to literally trip over it because this is a tripping hazard, but that's a discussion for another day. Now, the colleagues of our window and facade, the VFF Association, they of course also cooperated with us, and they issued a pamphlet with recommendations that I'm also like to reference because I think it's quite astounding that even here, with the glazings that we're talking about, we see the recommendation to do it in VSG or ESG, but a recommendation is just a recommendation and not a requirement. And an additional paper that we have released, which is information on safety glass in the new DIN 18008, uh, which has a subheading that says only safety glass is like safety glass. That's where we're looking at the state of the art. As I've mentioned, I can only once again emphasize that this is important, and we do assume that anything and everything that hasn't already been published is defined as a state of the art. And that's why our lawyers and legal experts also believe it's not going to be enough. Oh, well, I stuck to paragraph, I stuck to 30, section 37, I glued some things down. But no, you actually really have to wonder about all the respective legal requirements that are relevant. And it really comes down to the discussion publicly accessible or not. So this is really public versus private. Here are some examples. Do you know this? The one on the left? This is Hans Schmidt's house in Mainbach at the Glasfachschule Rheinbach, a glass working school. And again, here it's publicly accessible, right? And you definitely have a house with lots of floor to ceiling glass surfaces. On the right hand side, it's obviously a private home, a residential house. And Mrs. Siebert also talked about the discussion, and I can only say that I really don't understand why there's so much energy and verve used on that discussion, saying, no, we as representatives of the trade, we as associations believe that it is our sacred duty to point out to our members that they only have to use safety glass here, but not here. So I think that the direction is always don't over-regulate it, and here you don't need it, in the private area you don't need it, there you don't need it. And I'm also not sure uh, I also want to make sure that you understand that we say that we said that this is not a fruitful discussion. And Mrs. Siebert actually talked about federal law and a couple of levels below that we actually have the traffic safety law that always applies to you, and of course also the generally known rules of state-of-the-art technology. And we actually did ask our legal team in terms of how they see it, and our legal experts said, well, imagine the following case. There is a highly glassed private building, the one that we just saw, for example, would do, and then the mailman comes and only wants to put a postcard into your mailbox, and by some strange accident he falls, and he falls into the regular fracture glass and either dies or is severely injured. And then he, of course, closed it up with the rhetoric question, do you really believe that you would win this particular litigation as a glass supplier or as the expert who recommended this? And then saying, oh, well, that's not publicly accessible because it's a private household. I'm not really sure if that's really getting us where we need to go. And Mrs. Ebert also introduced additional differentiations, and he said in multiple family homes, in staircase where lots of people run by, you're going to definitely agree to the fact that it's publicly accessible. If you do a party at home and you invite 30 people, that was also publicly accessible. By the way, Mrs. Ingrid, you also didn't mention one thing that you also had on the slide, that we also have the slide right there, the legal opinion, because it also said that the 18008 does include a phrase which stands apart with which it needs to be freely publicly accessible. and that the German Supreme Court did define the freely publicly accessible term maybe as it is, but I also doubt the fact that I also want to emphasize the fact that probably you and I both have a little hobby lawyer within us, and I think it's really tricky to define those things for all of us. I think, here we just sat down and wrote down a regulation with a general phrasing, which is generally or publicly accessible. And I think armies of lawyers could deal with that, and you could then, of course, also talk about and discuss whether that is applicable or not. And of course, our recommendation is always recommend safety glass. You are, of course, the specialist companies, and it's of course always a tricky question that we're mentioning here in this particular block. We're just amongst us friends with a couple of thousands of people joining us on the stream, and that's why I'm just saying it. Our glass suppliers, our members, oftentimes don't even know what a glass is being used that is ordered. And if one piece of insulating glass, 4 millimeter float, 60 millimeter give, 4 millimeter coated glass, all of that is being ordered, you're not obligated to ask them or to even disclose the fact, oh, is this going to be used in a freely publicly accessible area? And do you have to use safety glass? Now, of course, they can just get the order, they can deliver, and they can say, here's what you ordered. But then, of course, the next level is maybe you, the people who are consulting this, and then maybe you are responsible for what you're actually ordering. And if you ask a lot of questions, you get a lot of answers, of course, as we say. And if you are consulting the end customer, then of course you're the expert, and then of course you are responsible for whatever is happening, whatever you're doing. I think that is really the main message that I would like to communicate to all of you today. And we have these things. We've got the windows, we've got those shopping windows. This is of course a very old photos that you can't claim, oh, every single day do people crash through windows and are severely injured. But I do believe this was actually a case where in the same window, in the same passage, people actually got pushed into multiple times. So then, after people were going to the bars, there's drunk people running around, they get into fights, and then here we are. So again, I think this is definitely something that is not really understandable, that this is still allowed to be done in regular normal classes. As Sieber was saying earlier, oh, this still has to be clarified. I think we definitely need to talk about that and clarify it. So overall, my takeaway is it is of course correct that there is no obligation for safety glass based on the 1808, but I do want to recommend to all of you to not get away with the thought, oh, well, if it's not explicitly recommended or explicitly required, it doesn't mean that you can still do whatever you want, right? There could be definitely some legal requirements, like, for example, the traffic safety elements that would lead to the fact that at the end of the day, you do need or you would have needed safety glass. And an additional quote, which we already had, which somebody is actually reporting on from litigation, which they had, they told us that some experts would be brought in, and of course you have a lot more experience with Sieber, and then they have to say, oh, was that correct or not? Should this product have been used that was used? In that case, the story was as goes. The judge had one question: would there have been a glass product with which we could have avoided what had happened? And the answer could have only been yes. Of course, you could have used safety glass in this particular case. You should have used it. With that, the case was lost immediately, and the person who consulted was at fault because they didn't consult for a more premium glass product. So the responsibility, I believe, is not just here with Corona. Everybody, of course, is walking around without Corona. It's also really the consultation that we have. I stole a quote from another architect. The properties of the material also determine the quality of the construction. I don't believe that this is all it. I think with a regular balcony door, for example, here, it's just been ignored, and sure, if it breaks, it breaks. Now, with that, if you want to be on the safe side, of course, you're only on the safe side if you use safety glass. Now, that's basically my counter argument, right?